Thank you very much, Sissy. And thank you very much indeed to all of the workers and all of the community members from Maracana who assisted us with producing this book, who opened their hearts to us, who explained the realities of the massacre to us, who brought home to us the anger that people felt because of the way in which they'd been treated by the police and by Lonmin. So first of all, thank you very much to those workers. And secondly, okay. And secondly, I want to thank the funders of our research, the Wraith Foundation, who are very generous in their support. Thirdly, I want to thank Jacana Media, who've done a fantastic job in bringing this book out so quickly. I think it's very unusual for publishers to be able to up their gear and move quickly in order to respond to events in the way in which Jacana Media have done. And then I would also like to thank my fellow speakers, and in particular Bishop Sioka, for gracing this occasion. My remarks will be brief in main because Bishop Sioka has said all the important things that need to be commented upon. But I would like to say something about the inquiry, because we launched this book at the inquiry in Rustenburg 2 days ago, and it was a very interesting experience. It was very interesting because it's clear that the book is going to be controversial, in part because people want to snap it up as quickly as they possibly can. And this led to something of an incident at the inquiry where the police said you can't give out any more copies like this because it's going to cause a riot. And then the policewoman who was explaining this to us and stopped us from distributing the book said, "But please can you give me one?" And then we were informed by the commissioner that we couldn't give them a copy of the book because it might appear as if their proceedings were going to be prejudiced by receiving a copy of the book from us. And then they sent round one of their officials and said, "Please can we have 3 copies, one for each of the commissioners?" So they want to be able to read the book, but they don't want the book to become part of the record of the inquiry. And to me this reflects the problem with the inquiry, that it's very much a lawyer's paradise. It's a place where lawyers can talk to each other and earn lots and lots of money. 30,000 a day we hear in some cases, 40,000 rands a day probably in other cases. The inquiry was due to last for 4 months, but now we understand that it's going to go on to June of next year. Now that may be advantageous for Lonmin, who have got big pockets, and for the police, who can spend our taxpayers' money on supporting lawyers. It's not particularly good news if you're members of families of those who have been slain, or the lawyers who are supporting them and receiving very little money indeed. But it's this inquiry that will shape the way in which most people understand what happened at Maracana. It's an alienating environment for anybody who is at all decent and working class. It's a place where you go where you don't get a hearing, where you don't get justice. It's a place where the chair of the commission says that what he's going to be concerned with is the evidence that's brought before him. Now, what's not brought before him is the way in which workers have been tortured by the police, intimidated by the police. What's not brought before him is the way in which workers have been arrested and threatened with being charged for murder and intimidated in that way. What's not brought before him is the experience of trauma that workers have suffered at the hands of the police, with 34 of them being killed. Now, none of those things come into the inquiry, and it leads me to the conclusion that we shouldn't expect the inquiry to come up with justice as their main concern. And justice for me is really very simple. And that means recognizing that what we're confronted with in Maracana is a massacre. And the definition of a massacre is really very simple, and it's something that's been considered by an historian, Mark Levine, who looked at massacres through the ages. And his key definition was that these are undoubtedly one-sided affairs. The number of people being killed was not the significant factor. It was that it's a one-sided affair. Now, what we've seen in Maracana is without doubt a one-sided affair. 34 workers were killed. No police were killed. No police were injured. This is a one-sided affair. This is about the police killing ordinary working-class people. And the justice that most of us want is to understand why the police did that, to hold them accountable for what they did, to make sense of the way in which they slaughtered people in the interests of capital. That's what justice, in my view, is about. Now, we're not going to get that from the inquiry. I'm not saying we can get that from one book, but what we can get from this book is an understanding of the way in which workers experienced that massacre, what it was like to be on the mountain on the day of the 16th of August, why it was that people were on the mountain on the 16th of August, what it was that led up to that, why they had to be on the mountain rather than somewhere else, why it was they had traditional weapons. These are things that we believe we've begun to explain in this book. And so this has led me on to try to think about the differences between a judicial inquiry and social scientific inquiry. And it seems to me there are a number of key points to be made. One, of course, in passing, is that legal inquiries are very expensive. And social science inquiries, with all due respect to the Wraith Foundation, are really rather cheap to do. But in the process of undertaking our inquiries, it's possible to do a number of things that don't happen with a judicial inquiry. The first is that we can move quickly. We don't have to wait for large bureaucracy to be established, for judges to be appointed, for teams to be appointed. We can move quickly, and that's what we did on this occasion. We began undertaking interviews 2 days after the massacre occurred. And we feel that this means that the kind of interviews we've secured have been very fresh. They're the experiences of workers soon after they experience them. They're not the views of workers that have been varnished in order that they can be presented to an inquiry which is largely unsympathetic to what it is that they want to say. It's also possible for us as social scientists to present the people we've interviewed as anonymous. Of course, we'd much rather have their names in the book, but when people are being intimidated, they're not going to want to give their names freely and speak openly and honest about their experiences. And it's quite common practice in the social sciences to refer to the people who are interviewed anonymously. We've talked about mine worker 1, mine worker 2, and so on. And that makes people freer to say what's on their mind, to explain what their experiences are, their experiences of work, their experiences of hardship, and their experiences of the massacre. So that's another plus point for us in attempting to develop our findings. The third thing is that we don't pretend to be neutral. I don't believe that the inquiry is neutral, by the way. I think the whole way in which it's set up means that it gives benefits to lawmen and to the police. But we don't have any pretense to being neutral. We recognise that we're on the side of the workers, on the side of the people who are victims in Marikana, but that doesn't prevent us from being objective, from being honest about what it is that we hear, from trying to develop a narrative which, as far as possible, is an accurate account of what happened. It helps us to develop some kind of conclusions which draw on our experience, our knowledge of history, and our understanding of some kind of theoretical premises which help us to put together an understanding of the events in Marikana. So we are not neutral and therefore capable of relating and responding to workers in a way which is sympathetic, but we are nevertheless objective in the way in which we undertake our inquiry. And this leads me on then to the further point, which is that as social scientists, we're not limited in the questions we ask. We can be interested not only in the present and the immediate events, but also interested in what motivated these events, in trying to understand the context in which they occurred, in recognising the continuities from apartheid, the way in which the behaviour of the police reflected the behaviour of the police under apartheid, the way in which the migrant labour system is a carryover from apartheid, the way in which the profit system continues from apartheid, the way in which the failure to nationalise industries and to ensure that the benefits of those industries are brought into being for the majority of the population, those things haven't changed at all. Much has not changed, and we need to reflect on that if we're to understand why Marikana occurred. We can't understand Marikana without that context of continuity from apartheid. So there are all sorts of benefits which social scientific inquiry, as reflected in this book, have over legal inquiry. But we're very modest as well about what we can achieve. We don't have the benefits of subpoenas. We don't have the capacity to present our book as if it is an overview, an answer which can compare with the inquiry. This is a book which is limited in its perspective. We're trying to present the view of one group who were present, the workers who were present, not everybody who was present. And we recognise that there will be mistakes and errors in the book, which we'll want to correct as we go on. But I do urge you to have a look at the book. This is a book which won't, it would seem, be part of the evidence in the inquiry, but we hope it will be part of the evidence that people take on board when they formulate their understanding of Maracana. Now let me just finish with the last paragraph of the book, because Maracana is not only about a tragic defeat, tragic event, people dying. It's also about the determination of people to fight for what is right under the most appalling conditions, to fight when they knew that they might be killed, and to continue that fight after their comrades had died. And so what we write in the final conclusion is this: the Maracana massacre was ghastly. In other settings, events of this kind have led to the defeat of a movement, or at least its abeyance. But that did not happen here. On the contrary, the strike got stronger. Workers faced trauma, the tribulations of burying their dead in faraway places, threatened sackings, lack of money for food, and attacks from unions and politicians. But by the 7th of September, the company was reporting the attendance at work was down to 2%. And after that, it gave up providing statistics. There was an undeclared state of emergency and a community leader was killed, but still the workers fought on until, on the 18th of September, they agreed to a settlement that secured the workers a victory. Had the strike collapsed, people across the country fighting poverty and injustice would have been cowed. The opposite happened. And from the perspective of the state and the bosses, the killings were an appalling miscalculation, an enormous setback. Somehow, despite 34 colleagues being killed, and with many more injured or detained, workers found the strength to pull themselves together and to determine that the strike would continue. This was one of the most remarkable acts of courage in labour history, anywhere and at any time. Amandla!